But there's like 5 didn't want to do it.
Thank you all so much for coming out here to Silent Barn and the Center for Strategic Art and Agriculture. My name is Larissa Reinhardt, and I have had the great pleasure and honor of running this space for 2 years. Today is actually the closing of CSAA. I'm moving on to bigger and better things, but I could not be happier or more grateful to end this amazing time here at Silent Barn at CSAA with this panel, and particularly Ellie Irons, who is the artist responsible for this show and also outside in the garden, if you had a chance to see it this spring and summer. With that, I'll just launch into the bios of our illustrious panelists here, and I'll start with Ellie, who is an interdisciplinary artist and educator, pursuing a long tradition of artist, naturalist, and contemporary and hybrid formats. Focusing on urban ecology, she uses a variety of media, from walks and workshops to drawing and video, to explore how human and non-human lives intertwine with other art systems, or with other earth systems. I am obviously a huge fan of Ellie's, and I encourage you to check out her work by looking at the show and being here already. So, Amy Burkhoff is a tropical ecologist who made a midlife career change from art to science. She moved to the East Village during the good old bad days, when every vacant lot was an unsavory dump full of promise, and her experiences as a community gardener inspired her interest in plants and the finely tuned interactions that they have with insects. And we're also so glad to have her here. Anne Prococo is a sculptor who often works with junk and junk spaces, materials and places that are overlooked, untended, and thus hosts numerous extraordinary possibilities, places where artifacts accumulate, weeds grow, and history is most visible. After earning her MFA from Rutgers University in 2008, Anne completed a fellowship with the Asian Cultural Association for Research and a production of new work in India. Marian Seamoon is a research-based artist whose interest in implications of socio-technical and environmental change. Working across mediums, she makes creative disruptions, objects, images, and experiences that poke, provoke, and reimagine existing systems. She's exhibited internationally, and her work is supported by Creative Capital, Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and the Foundation for Contemporary Arts. And finally, and last but not least, Sasha Wright is a plant biologist and theoretical ecologist committed to addressing ecological problems through research and education. She is currently working on several projects involving how plants interact with extreme environments. She went to Beloit College in Wisconsin. Beloit. I got that one wrong. And studied environmental biology. She then worked as a GIS technician of the National Park Service in South Florida. She has conducted field research from the Serengeti National Park to native Wisconsin prairie to tropical dry forest in Panama and the European grasslands. So without further ado, again, thank you so much for coming, and I'll turn it over to Ellie, who is moderating this evening.
Thank you so much, Larissa. And thanks to all of you for coming out on this Martin Luther King Day holiday. I appreciate it. To obviously say a huge thanks to Larissa and the Silent Barn and the Center for Strategic Art and Agriculture for existing and providing a space and a place for me to garden, which has been an amazing opportunity. And then also I wanted to say thank you to the Bushwick Food Co-op, who very generously provided snacks for us tonight. So check them out if you don't already know about them. We're going to be showing some images tonight due to the cozy nature of the venue. We're showing them up there. I'll probably turn down the lights a little bit more, actually, now that I think about it. Let's do this big guy. There. So if you need to rotate a little bit, this would be a good time to do it.
Just like right at mine.
There we go. Problem plants, weeds in ecology, art, and culture. Before I jump into talking a little bit more about weeds, I wanted to talk a little bit about the space we're sitting in. We're surrounded by a project of mine called Invasive Pigments, and that's what brought me to the CSAA in the first place. Invasive Pigments is a project that I've been using to explore the weeds in Bushwick. I call them spontaneous urban plants, actually, usually. And basically, I've been gathering the colorful parts of the plants, of which there are many, and using them to make watercolor paints. And you can see some of the results of that around the room. I started this project gathering in Bushwick, and when I met Larissa, she actually thought, okay, you're out gathering these plants, let's try actually cultivating them. So I took over the garden out there. This is what it looked like in July last year. I think fondly of that time right now. You can still go out and see it. It's encased in a greenhouse right now. So plants aren't really alive anymore, but they'll come back. There's plans for something else to happen in the summer. So I don't want to talk too much about that. More interested in getting on to the panelists who join us today. I'm really happy that the project and the things I've learned through working with these plants led me to the people who are sitting here. All of them have influenced me in one way or another in terms of how I think about plant life, and specifically plant life in the city, or the kind of tension between plants that we call weeds and plants that we think of as valuable in one way or another. So Larissa already did a great job of introducing these people, but I did want to point out that I really am excited about the kind of balance of having two artists and two scientists, but I think artists who are very interested in and have dialogued a lot with people coming from the sciences, and scientists who are very open or actually have an art practice or have had, in the case of Amy. So that, I think, is has been another thing that this project has been able to bring about. So pleased with that. And then just to kind of kick us off, I wanted to give a little bit of an example of kind of stories that come out of my pigment project. This, would you hold that for me, Jimmy, for a second, is the same plant as this. Okay, so these are both Oriental bittersweet. And Oriental bittersweet is a plant that you can buy at a holiday market. You might make it into a wreath or something like that. This one's looking a little sad at this point because the berries have shriveled a bit. It's also an invasive plant that's being battled in hardwood forests around here. This is an invasive bittersweet vine that has coiled around a native grapevine, is kind of using it to climb higher in the canopy and eventually leaf out above a hardwood forest. So depending on the context and depending on how we think about these plants, they can have really different roles in our ecosystem and in culture and in art. I use the berries here to make a pigment. It's kind of an orange. I've been using unwanted Oriental bittersweet vines that have been cut out of forests to make sculpture. So kind of maybe we'll put that back. Just a little bit of a jumping off point as we are thinking about these plants tonight. Stick that right. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand things off to our first panelist, who's Amy. Larissa did a great introduction, but I did want to say that Amy and I got to know each other through a class that I did at City College last year. Amy also was in the biology department there, and she was one of the only scientists who wrote back to me and said, yes, bring your class of experimental master's students to my lab. That's great. And we ended up doing some plant pigment experiments together, and it was really fun. And we've kept in touch since then, and she has some interesting stories about things beyond her work as a tropical ecologist that involves plants living right here in the city. So I'll let you, maybe I'll shift over and you can
how do I get
grab that, and I'll pull you down, Miriam, so you'll have an easier chance. And then,
so how do I get
so
this
all
on
you
full
need
screen?
to do is it'll show full screen there, and here it won't. So you'll just click. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So my weed story starts way back in the good old bad old days of the East Village, when the city was systematically divesting itself of housing stock and leaving behind piles of rubble. Now, there are both plants and people that thrive under adverse conditions, as you all know. And you put them together, and all of a sudden you've got a community garden. So I was a very early member of a rather large community garden, and still am, at the corner of 6th Street and Avenue B. And at the time that I first joined the garden, I imagined, like many gardeners, that I would probably be planting little tidy rows of food. However, as I proceeded to learn more about plants and got more interested in plants for their own purposes and got more interested in their interactions with insects, I ultimately ended up devoting my plant to feeding beetles. So to do this, I was particularly interested in two beetle species. One is the locust borer, which mates on goldenrod, and the other is a four-eyed milkweed beetle, which mates and feeds on milkweed. And I started out by taking out my crops and putting in 3 goldenrod species and 3 milkweed species. And within a year or two, I was down to 1 and 1. So they decided that really quickly. Mm-hmm. And then they've both been hanging on since then. But the milkweed, which are the sort of big pink globular flowers that you see there, they're really good at living in disturbed environments, which makes them perfect for a community garden, and they've been very successful there. And I think that one of the secrets of their success is that they are able to grow clonally. They don't have to reproduce sexually, so they send out these underground stems that can run for meters and then send down little roots and send up new shoot systems. So actually, I don't know, we don't have an arrow here. Well, part of those, all of the ones to the left there are ones in a neighboring plot that have just kind of migrated from my garden plot. So clonal reproduction. Another secret to the milkweed success is that it's got a really awesome chemical defense system. When you break the tissues, you see this copious white latex that gives milkweed its name. That latex has cardiac glycosides, which are basically vertebrate heart poisons. And so you can see pictures of places where browsing animals exist, and everything will be browsed down to the ground except for the milkweed, which will be standing up strong. So that's one of its secrets. This chemical story is best known in relation to monarch butterflies, which feed on milkweed. The females lay their eggs on the milkweed. The eggs hatch into little tiny caterpillars that feed on the milkweed, and they sequester these toxins, and that gives them some measure of defense from their own predators. So if you have a naive bluebird that has no prior experience with monarchs and feed it a monarch, it will eat it, but it will immediately throw up. And it remembers that because it's not a pleasant experience, and thereafter it will avoid other monarchs and even other insects that just look like monarchs. One of the other things that I think is really interesting about milkweed has to do with its sexual reproduction system. Now, most plants send their sperm out into the world packaged in little dust-like pollen grains that you see covering my shoe over to the left there. And milkweed doesn't do that. It bundles its pollen together in these sacs called pollinia, and they're attached to these little arms that actually will move and click shut on an insect's leg. And down in this, I don't know if I get, oops. Okay, well I missed
I think if you go back and then go to that slide again, I bet you it'll play again.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So there's a central column. The pollinia are tucked into these little slits, and there's somebody just managing to pull one out using a forceps there. So they're hidden within that column. Now, surrounding that central column and its slits with the pollinia are the attractive parts of the flower. And the innermost pointed parts are called horns, and those are actually nectaries, and they produce lots and lots of nectar. And then the surrounding parts are called hoods, and they accumulate lots and lots of nectar. And any place that I've ever been in the world where I've seen milkweeds growing, there's always been a few ants tucked in enjoying that bounty. Now, of course, from the milkweed's point of view, it's not necessarily about ants. The nectar is really there to attract pollinators. And the optimal pollinators for milkweed seem to be fairly large, robust, strong bees. And many bees have they have claws on the end of their feet that are like little grappling hooks, and they're really, really effective at getting down into those slits, catching onto the pollinia, and they're big enough and strong enough that they can actually pull them back out again, and then they will get transferred to another plant. So in the 20 years that I've been watching my milkweed, I've probably seen more than a dozen bee species visiting it, lots of different bees, including this hapless honeybee who found out the hard way that, yes, there is too much of a good thing. Now, the thing with these slits is that it's basically protecting the pollen, which is costly for the plant to manufacture. So it's protecting this valuable pollen from inefficient pollinators that would not be very good at transferring it. And so if you have an insect that isn't big enough and strong enough to pull its leg out of that slit becomes a deadly trap. And so you go around and you see these poor dead flies hanging out of the occasional milkweed flower. And even to the right, I once found a little tiny bee that just wasn't strong enough to get its leg out. Now, another way to avoid the deadly slit trap is to have a really long tongue, like this hawk moth does, or like these clearwing moths do. And another way to avoid the deadly slit trap is to use your beak to go right into the plant vascular system, which is what the milkweed bug does. One of the less appealing groups of insects associated with milkweeds are milkweed aphids. And these have a really incredibly fast reproductive cycle. So a few of them will arrive, and before you know it, they've just like amplified and taken over your whole plant, and they're not very pretty to look at, and they really can do a lot of damage. And so what I do in my garden is I try and watch for when they first come, and I take a lot of them away, but I leave some because I want to have food for the predators and the parasites that will come and attack them. So to the right, you have ladybird beetle larvae, voracious predators of aphids. And I always want to keep that system intact. So for the first 15 years after I planted my milkweed and goldenrod, I saw lots of interesting things, but I never saw the beetle that I planted the milkweed to attract. And then one night in 2010, I was out in the garden with a friend of mine, and I noticed a very weird kind of feeding damage that I'd never seen before, where just the tips of the leaves were gone. And we poked and poked around, and you can't really see it here, but we did eventually find one milkweed beetle that had found my plot after all those years. And this is what they do. They're diminutive engineers. They cut slits in the midrib so that the latex drains out, and then they're able to feed upstream of that without getting their mandibles all gummed up. So I was incredibly excited that I finally got a milkweed beetle after 15 years, but I did think, well, one milkweed beetle does not a population make, which might have been. I don't need sound. It's just traffic. Well, you can have it. It's just ambient traffic. So there they are. By the next year, I have quite a few more. They've trenched the milkweed. The latex has run out. The female's feeding. The male's on top. And now we have another male trying to unseat the mating male. And guys with long horns, you know, they end up going head to head. They're going horn to horn with each other. And sometimes when the guys get more interested in fighting than they are in mating, then the females kind of start to lose interest a little bit. So she's really had it. She's trying to extricate herself. The male is trying desperately to hang on to the female and continue to fight the other male. But eventually, the female just walks away, and the guys just keep fighting. So this is what my milkweed plants looked like last year. These guys not only feed on the leaves, but they also, the immature stages, feed on the rhizome. So they are really doing a number on my milkweed, and I think they're setting the stage for a comeback by the goldenrod, is what I think is happening. Well, no one was more surprised than me when milkweed actually made it onto the conservation radar. And it didn't get on the radar because of my beetles, but it got on because of its role as a host plant for monarchs, which in some parts of the country are undergoing steep declines. And these are butterflies that migrate to Mexico in the winter, and they overwinter in these high-altitude conifer forests. And so one of the things that's implicated in their declines is habitat loss and climate anomalies in these conifer forests. And the other thing that is proposed in the Midwest to be resulting in declines is the use of Monsanto Roundup-ready crops. And these are, farmers are planting seeds that are genetically modified to resist the use of this herbicide Roundup, and then the farmers can spray with Roundup to kill all of the weeds that are competing with their crop plants. And inadvertently, of course, one of the things that they're getting are the milkweeds. So it's on the conservation radar. People in parks and gardens, I wouldn't have believed this 20 years ago, but they're now planting milkweeds. But they're sometimes trying to avoid the most aggressive and sort of unpleasant aspects of my common milkweed by planting other species that are less aggressive, like butterfly weed. And butterfly weed it's pretty and it's a good nectar source, but it's not actually a very good monarch host plant, and it doesn't actually have milky latex, so I'm pretty sure it's not going to be doing anything for my beetles. So, why all this whoop about weeds? Well, one thing is that weeds have a competitive edge, and we're going to be needing these opportunists because we're entering a time of very unpredictable environmental events, and we need things that are able to roll with the punches. So weeds aren't usually on the conservation radar, but some of them, like milkweed, support large and diverse guilds of insect associates, including multiple trophic levels. And finally, native, but not necessarily the non-native weeds, I think can play a really vital role in conserving not just species, but species interaction. So the non-natives make pigments. Eat them. Make pigments.
That's good.
Okay.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Rachel. And we are going to have some time for Q&A at the end, so any brilliant questions you come up with, hang on to them. Our next panelist will be Anne, so maybe Anne and Amy we'll just do musical chairs, swap with each other. So Larissa also did a great intro for Anne, but I did want to say that this is the first time that Anne and I have met each other tonight, and I'm so pleased that she was willing enough to, have faith in that this would work out and be a good place to be. But I've been watching her work online and have heard about it over the years, so I'm just really pleased that you're able to be here and tell us more about it.
I'm pleased too. Thank you. As Larissa read in my bio, I'm mostly do sculpture, including some public art, and I'm interested in things that most people think are worthless, such as trash, which I've used for found materials, junk spaces, which in your bio you described as unsavory dumps full of promise. Great line. And more and more, especially over the past year, weeds. But for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on weeds-related projects. And I wanted to share this great quote by Gary Snyder, who wrote Practice of the Wild. Maybe I can read it quickly. Exquisite complex beings in their energy webs inhabiting the fertile corners of the urban world in accord with the rules of wild systems, the visible hardy stalks and stems of vacant lots and railroads, the persistent raccoon squads, bacteria in the loam and in our yogurt, the term culture in its meaning of a deliberately maintained aesthetic and intellectual life, and in its other meaning of the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns, is never far from the biological root meaning, as in yogurt culture, a nourishing habitat. Civilization is permeable and could be as inhabited as the wild is. And then the next two slides are not my art. They're they're related. They're kind of documentation of some of the junk spaces. But I just wanted to share them because they're great photos of weeds. So this is, which I thought you all would be interested in. So this is a stack of ceiling tiles, like those drop ceilings, that were sitting there and soaking up moisture for so long that all of this moss started to grow all over it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's gorgeous.
And this is a abandoned rail line that goes under Jersey City called the Erie Cut, and is all overgrown. It's probably one of the greenest, wildest parts of the city. And then here is a very quick project that I did in the Netherlands. So this was when I went there to do this short residency. Most of that city was so orderly and clean, except for this one hillside. And especially, like, people's front yards were, like, they really like their manicured shrubs in different shapes. So I purchased a spherical shrub and planted it on this overgrown hillside. Here's another picture. And this is an accordion book that I made there, window plants. So for the one side of it, I got the window blinds and held them up, had a friend hold them up behind a weed to make like a portraits of different weeds. And then on the bottom is the office building across from where our residency was, where they had tiny little cactuses and potted plants all in a row on their window ledge. And this is from about a year ago in January. I did this, I organized this workshop in India, outside of Mumbai. It was a census of weeds, where these kids took drawings and measurements of different weeds, and then we collected them into a Tumblr website. But it was inspired by the census of trees that their town had done. You see, they were painting this white, orange, white pattern on the trees. And we did something a little bit similar on the weeds. So there's a screenshot of the Tumblr, and then also made QR tags to tie to the weeds. Then in the same town, I made this sculpture on this small. It looks like a really small island, but it's actually, the sculpture is a little bit taller than I am. And the town called Thane, over the past 30 years or so, I was told that it had grown like exponentially and kind of carved itself out of the forest. So this is like one of the few like really wild places left in the town. This overgrown, like really viney island. So I made this structure that's meant to resemble a building that's under construction. Like it has the nails for the rebar at the top and the tree trunks holding up the top couple of floors. So kind of like under construction and then abandoned. So to kind of connect with the city's history. This is a wheat pasting project that I did in South Orange, New Jersey, where I took photos of the weeds, local weeds, enlarged them, and wheat pasted them onto buildings around town. So there were 6 sites, and I'll show you a few of them. So this is also kind of playing with scale, as if the weeds are like overtaking the architecture, kind of post-apocalyptic seeming. And then this is a project that I did in Jersey City, where I live. I connected with a volunteer group that maintains one park there, and every Saturday morning when it's nice, they go and weed the park. And so, but instead of throwing the weeds out, I collected them and planted them in boxes and kept them in my backyard and watered them, and they grew. And then I moved them to a shipping container that has windows. That's like a temporary project space for artists. And that pink is kind of grow light. So this stayed there for about a month. And then this I thought I would share with you. I made this proposal last weekend for a project I would like to do. This is, it would be like enlarged terracotta flower pots, but with the bottom part just in ply. Like, of course, it would just really be like a wall. And then the idea would be that inside should not be cut or weeded, just let to grow, but then the outside could still be maintained as a lawn. And I would love to include existing plants or shrubs in there.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Anne. All right, so Dr. Sasha Wright. Sasha I met in an awesome context of GenSpace, the community biolab. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's worth looking up. Ran a workshop called Invasion Ecology for a while back. Was last year sometime.
Yeah.
And kind of a range of us artists, the interested scientists, joined up and attempted to learn a little bit about population ecology and also grow some invasive, potentially competitive species in petri dishes. So that was a lot of fun, and I'm glad that Sasha was willing to come out and share some knowledge.
Thank you. That's actually also how I met Miriam.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Not the same workshop, though. You weren't
No,
at that.
she sought me out after I did that workshop
Got it.
because
Okay.
she's also associated with GenSpace.
Got it.
GenSpace is a good connector.
Yes.
Okay, so I am really a theoretical ecologist, so I spend a lot of time thinking about math and like organizing principles for big systems. So I am going to really focus today on those systems, and the story is pretty scientific, but it's pretty straightforward, and it's really a story about how some of the science behind why weeds are good. So most of what I do is really about biodiversity. So I think this is going to just be relatively widely covered by the popular media, but biodiversity is declining. And this is having all of these big effects on ecosystems, and that's really what I spend the majority of my time thinking about. What is the effect of biodiversity decline? So here are a bunch of graphs about what that looks like in different groups, not just plants. So this is a picture of a field site that I worked at last year in Germany that manipulates biodiversity in a really, really tightly controlled experimental context. So there are all of these like big agricultural plots, and we weed them. That's basically what that means. And the really diverse plots are really beautiful. And we think a lot about how biodiversity is beautiful, but does it serve some sort of kind of functional purpose that we can back up really easily, and we can show to policymakers, and we can help make kind of money-based decisions and other quantifiable decisions. So besides being beautiful, is biodiversity also necessary is really the question that I want to first emphasize in this talk. So this is a picture also taken at this field site in June 2013 after a 200-year flood event. So the site hadn't seen a flood event this big for 200 years. And these types of events are becoming increasingly common with climate change. So all of a sudden a 200-year flood event doesn't mean it hasn't happened in 200 years. It just means it used to not happen that often. There are all these ecosystem services that you get out of biodiversity. So high biodiversity systems tend to produce more food. They might produce more building materials. We get things like pollinators out of higher diversity systems. They can be natural disaster buffers in disasters like this one. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we've seen in the last 25 years of studying this question in a really experimental way, that really supports this idea that biodiversity is not only beautiful, but also it is necessary. So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about how we do that, because I think it's kind of fun. So what we do, like I said, what we do when we study biodiversity in a really quantitative way is we just take like a bunch of agricultural fields, basically, and if you imagine any agricultural field you've ever seen, so a big cornfield, it will just be subdivided into like 5 by 5 meter plots or 20 by 20 meter plots. So it'll just be subdivided into a big grid. And some of those grid cells will be planted with one species, and some of those grid cells will be planted with the same number, so the same number of individuals, but of 20 species. And then we'll spend a whole bunch of money for 20 years paying interns to go out and weed these plots every summer, all summer long. And then we just measure a ton of stuff. And it's really the only physical way we can model this stuff, but it's really the only physical way to start asking real questions about what the outcome of biodiversity is. So it's a really cool kind of field of research, and it's what I spent most of my time doing. And there are a bunch of experiments all over the world, and I've worked in several of them. And really, what's the cool stuff? So there are a bunch of graphs coming up, and I really love graphs, so hopefully I will impart on you a love of graphs. So the biggest thing we've learned is that higher diversity systems are have higher yield, right? And so in an agricultural context, again, what we care about is yield, right? I mean, a farmer wants more corn. So what the biggest result of all of these experiments has been that higher diversity systems make more corn in more complicated ways, but make more of the stuff, right? So it's sometimes called biomass, it's sometimes called productivity, it's sometimes called yield. Okay, so this increasing line here is just showing more diversity, more yield. The other thing that happens is that in a thing like the flood that I just showed you, that big flood that happened in 2013, what we see is higher diversity systems, they fluctuate less. They can handle something like a flood better. So you have a thing, you basically have something like a drought or a flood. You have pre-disturbance yield, pre-disturbance biomass, and if you're growing plants in a really low diversity system, you see a big drop off in how well those plants do. So that's the low div on the left. If you're growing plants in a really high diversity system, you see very little variation. So you get this stability thing out of diversity too. You get yield, you get stability. You actually get so much more yield that somebody did a study in 2009, some of these German guys that I worked with last year actually, that showed that you get as much extra yield out of diversity as you get out of fertilizer. Right? So we're always putting all this fertilizer down to get more yield out of our corn. If we actually grew more diverse agricultural fields, we probably would also get a lot more yield out of those fields. I think I read today that 30% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from growing monoculture crops worldwide. So one of the cool things that you get out of a higher diversity system is you get more storage of the carbon. So greenhouse gases, CO2, you get more storage of the carbon that's sitting in the atmosphere into the soil if you're just growing more plants together. Right? So that's what that's showing. You get more pollinators, so that complements what Amy was saying. More plant species, just a higher number of different pollinator species happen to like to be there. You get more decomposers, more herbivores, more predators. So you get more diversity at other trophic levels. Okay? So this is kind of an onslaught of data that I'm giving you guys, but hopefully what I'm kind of trying to show you is biodiversity makes everything better. And this huge graph right here is this cool paper that essentially just with data shows that. So, what the heck am I talking about diversity for? Maybe everybody in this room already loves diversity, and this is a panel about weedy species. So, they really have a lot to do with each other. So, what about species invasions? The cool thing about weedy species that a lot of people in both of our field, really, both Amy and my field, really haven't quite gotten on board with, is that weedy species often increase diversity. Okay, so you might have a system like New York City, where without the weedy species, you have 20 species. So this is showing on islands and on continents, plants, fishes, and birds. The green bars are if we counted diversity across small scales and lots of different areas all over the globe. If we counted the native species, it would be about 20. On continents, if we added the exotic, the weedy species, it would go up to 100 on average at small scales. So if we add weedy species into this kind of idea of small scale diversity, like a plot, like a community garden, like a abandoned parking lot, like Central Park, like any of these small scale sites, we actually start to see this increase in biodiversity, and we know a lot about how great that is. So this is kind of how I think about weedy species. At the system level, they tend to have they often, as a system, they often have positive effects. And I'll show one example at the end where it's like, well, sometimes weedy species don't have positive effects. And then this is just one example one way, one example the other way. So ironwood is a introduced species in Hawaii that a colleague and good friend of mine studies really closely. So just to kind of make the case for you, again, this is showing that, so the x-axis here is age of site. But really the point here is that for the native-dominated forests, so the forests that don't have the invasion or the exotic weedy species haven't come in, overall species richness, regardless of age, is lower. Species richness is another word for biodiversity. So all of those gray dots are lower than all of those black dots. So in the native forests, diversity is consistently lower than in all of the exotic, weedy, invaded forests. Pretty compelling. And then we have these cases. So this is a slide that I see ecologists show all of the time. This is kudzu. And obviously there are certain species that have, and I think that kind of the case that the framework that I tend to bring to this is the really, really negative weedy species actually tend to be the anomalies. As a system, a lot of exotic species, weeds, don't have negative effects. But we get really compelled by the individual species that have horribly negative effects, like kudzu, where it just comes in and covers the whole environment and essentially becomes a monoculture, right? It essentially becomes just one species and everything else dies. And in those cases, we do probably need to make management decisions that are, again, prioritizing diversity. So my lens is, well, if diversity is always our goal, we can kind of move away from whether or not something's a weed and start managing for smarter, higher diversity systems, as opposed to kind of 150 year ago, pre-colonial ideals. And then I'm just going to leave you with one more idea, and this may be too much to have put on a slide, but the reason I just brought you into like an advanced community ecology course. The reason that this is up here is that there's two things. Okay, so the top one, there's a big red arrow and it says invasion, and the bottom one, there's a big blue arrow and it says habitat disturbance. Do you guys see those arrows? Mm-hmm. So the point that this graph is trying to show is that the pressure might be the weedy species. That's the red arrow. Or the pressure might be habitat disturbance, and the weeds are just responding to that disturbance. Right? And so if we try to fix the weeds, but the problem is the disturbance, we actually won't end up with solving, right? It's a symptom. So we won't end up solving the problem that we set out to solve. We might just end up with like a really depauperate system that now has nothing in it. We keep weeding out the weeds, but nothing can establish there because the habitat's so disturbed. And so this is actually from a cool paper where the farthest right thing is showing that the data shows much more support for this habitat disturbance thing. So, and with that, I have a bunch of biodiversity, and I'll save questions till it is.
All right, we have one more panelist. Miriam Samin is up. We're going to do a little dance here, apparently.